elderly patients in his care got substandard care. So in April, this swindler was rightly sentenced to 3 years in prison. But he didn't stay long, thanks to our president. He gave him a full and unconditional pardon after just 90 days. Trump and the Republicans cut $1 trillion from Medicaid, and Americans are not going to have their health care. And meanwhile, this guy literally steals $38 million from all of us. And Trump lets him walk free and back home to his $1.2 million home.
Listen to what you just heard, because we need to understand this moment in crystalline clarity before it dissolves into the noise of normalized corruption and becomes just another forgettable outrage in the endless scroll of American decline. And this is where we are friends. This is the precise moral coordinate where we find ourselves standing in December 2025, watching the machinery of plutocratic immunity operate with such brazen shamelessness that it would make the robber barons of the Gilded Age blush with embarrassment, because Joseph Schwartz was sentenced in April 2025 to 36 months in federal prison after pleading guilty to failing to pay more than $38 million in employment taxes withheld from workers across his nursing home network. And then just months later, just 90 days into his pathetic sentence, Trump granted Schwartz a full and unconditional pardon, and we're about to unpack exactly what this means, not just for healthcare, not just for elderly Americans rotting in understaffed nursing facilities, but for the entire architecture of justice in a nation that has decided wealth and political connections are the only currencies that matter anymore. And you need to understand the sheer audacity here, because while Republicans are slashing Medicaid by unprecedented amounts, we'll get to those staggering numbers in just a moment, they're simultaneously letting the people who literally stole from that very same healthcare system walk free and return to their mansions. And this isn't just hypocrisy, this is something far more sinister. This is the construction of a two-tiered legal system so explicit, so unapologetic that it functions as a kind of aristocratic immunity where the rich simply do not face consequences, and where Trump serves as the feudal lord dispensing favors to those who can afford the price of admission. Schwartz controlled nearly 100 nursing homes in 11 states and was sentenced in federal court in April of this year to 36 months in prison for his role in a $38 million employment tax fraud scheme. And here's where it gets truly grotesque, because he withheld the amounts from employees' paychecks, then pocketed it, which means he didn't just defraud the government, he robbed working people, nurses, aides, janitors, the very workers caring for our most vulnerable elderly citizens, and he took money directly from their paychecks, money they had earned through backbreaking labor in facilities that were already running, on skeleton crews, and he just kept it for himself, and then used it to live in luxury while 2 homes were run so poorly that the state of Arkansas had to take them over, because the care was so inexcusably substandard, so dangerous that state authorities had no choice but to intervene. And you want to know what happens when nursing homes are run by people who view elderly human beings as profit centers to be squeezed and exploited. People suffer, people die in pain and indignity and neglect. And now Trump has decided this man deserves to walk free after serving barely 3 months. But wait, because it gets worse, and you knew it would get worse, because with Trump it always gets worse. And here's the bombshell that should be dominating every news cycle. Lobbyists Jack Berkman and Jacob Wohl accepted $960,000 to lobby for a federal pardon on behalf of Joseph Schwartz, and Schwartz was granted clemency on November 14, 2025. And we need to pause here to let that sink in, because this isn't speculation. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented fact that Schwartz paid nearly $1 million to lobbyists to secure his pardon. At about the same time Schwartz was being convicted by the feds, he retained 2 lobbyists at the cost of almost $1 million for the purpose of securing him a federal pardon. And if this doesn't make your blood boil, if this doesn't activate every moral nerve ending you possess, then I don't know what will, because we are watching in real time the purchasing of justice, the commodification of mercy, the transformation of presidential clemency from a constitutional power meant to correct injustices into a luxury good, available only to those who can write 7-figure checks to the right fixers with the right access to the right authoritarian. Liz Oyer, a former U.S. pardon attorney, explained there is a special tier of justice for people who can afford to pay, and Oyer was fired by the Trump administration in March, and of course she was fired because truth-tellers don't survive in regimes built on corruption. Trump fired Liz Oyer and installed political loyalist Ed Martin in the role, and Ed Martin described the rationale for granting pardons as no MAGA left behind, which is perhaps the most honest articulation of authoritarian favoritism we've heard from this administration, because it's not about justice, it's not about mercy, it's about rewarding loyalty, it's about creating a protected class of people who can commit crimes with impunity as long as they bend the knee to Trump, and we need to understand this for what it is, which is the systematic dismantling of equal justice under law replaced by a patronage system where your relationship to the leader determines your legal status. And this is feudalism. This is the court of Louis XIV, where proximity to power grants immunity from consequences. And now let's talk about the Medicaid cuts, because this is where the moral obscenity reaches levels that should spark mass mobilization in the streets, because Republicans aren't just pardoning healthcare fraudsters, they're simultaneously gutting the very programs those fraudsters stole from. The resolution will cut about $880 billion from the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which oversees healthcare spending in programs such as Medicaid. Over the next decade, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act will reduce federal Medicaid spending by around $1 trillion from 2025 through 2034, with the largest cuts coming from Medicaid work reporting requirements, limits on state provider tax arrangements, and restrictions on state-directed Medicaid payments. And let me repeat that because the number is so staggering, it almost defies comprehension. $1 trillion cut from Medicaid, which provides health care to more than 70 million Americans, including children, people with disabilities, elderly people in nursing homes, and working poor families, who are one medical emergency away from financial catastrophe. The budget math starkly exposes congressional Republicans' priorities: $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts that hurt tens of millions of low-income families, with $1 trillion in tax cuts for the top 1% of Americans. And there it is, laid bare with mathematical precision, the entire ideological project of contemporary conservatism, which is the upward redistribution of wealth from those who have nothing to those who have everything, the systematic immiseration of the vulnerable to finance luxury and opulence for all the already grotesquely wealthy. And we're supposed to pretend this is about fiscal responsibility. We're supposed to accept the framing that this is about eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, when the evidence of their actual priorities is so overwhelming, so undeniable that it insults our intelligence to even pretend otherwise, because they're not fighting fraud, they're pardoning fraudsters. They're not protecting taxpayers, they're protecting tax cheats. They're not eliminating waste, they're enriching the wealthy on the backs of sick children and disabled adults and elderly people who will lose access to the medications and care they need to survive. A preliminary estimate from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office said the proposals would reduce the number of people with health care by 8.6 million over the decade. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the total number of uninsured will rise by 17 million people by 2034, which means 17 million human beings will lose health care coverage, not because of some unavoidable economic necessity, not because the richest country in human history cannot afford to provide basic medical care, but because Republicans have decided that tax cuts for billionaires are more important than insulin for diabetics, more important than chemotherapy for cancer patients, more important than nursing home care for Alzheimer's patients, and we need to name this for what it is, which is social murder, the knowing imposition of conditions that will result in preventable deaths and suffering among populations deemed expendable by the powerful. But Trump claims he's fighting fraud, right? He says repeatedly that he's going to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicare and Medicaid, right? Trump has said he will target fraud in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And during an address to Congress, Trump said his administration had found hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud without citing any specific examples. And yet, in his first and second terms, Trump has granted pardons or commutations to at least 68 people convicted of fraud crimes, and Trump issued about 190 pardons and commutations in the final 2 months of his first term, including for some healthcare fraudsters convicted of schemes with astonishing costs. And here's where the cognitive dissonance becomes so extreme that you'd think it would cause mass psychological crisis among his supporters, but somehow it doesn't, because Trump granted a commutation to Philip S. Formas, a Florida healthcare executive convicted in 2019 of a $1.3 billion Medicare and Medicaid fraud scheme. And let me say that number again, $1.3 billion. S. Formas and co-conspirators for more than 2 decades cycled thousands of Medicare and Medicaid patients through a network of nursing and assisted living facilities, despite the fact they did not qualify for such care, which means for 20 years this man systematically defrauded taxpayers and exploited vulnerable patients for profit, and Trump freed him. Trump also granted a commutation to Salomon Melgen, a Florida eye doctor who was serving a 17-year prison sentence for defrauding Medicare of $42 million, and Melgen falsely diagnosed patients with eye diseases, then gave them unnecessary care, including laser treatments and painful eye injections. And do you understand what that means? This doctor gave people unnecessary painful medical procedures, treatments they didn't need, injections into their eyes for diseases they didn't have, in order to bill Medicare and make himself rich, and Trump said this man deserves to be free. Trump granted clemency to Lawrence Duran, who was convicted in 2011 for defrauding Medicare and money laundering, pilfer $205 million from the program through false means, and the pattern is unmistakable and undeniable. Trump pardons healthcare fraudsters who steal hundreds of millions, even billions, from Medicare and Medicaid, while simultaneously claiming he's cutting these programs to eliminate fraud. Trump's commutation shows the GOP has little interest in saving Americans from those aiming to defraud taxpayer-funded programs, and the goal is seemingly to worsen the two-tiered criminal legal system that disproportionately targets non-white people, the poor and the left. And here's what makes this so particularly galling, so specifically enraging in this moment. As one of the first actions of his second term, Trump fired 17 independent inspectors general responsible for rooting out fraud and waste in government, which means the very people whose job is to investigate and prevent the kind of fraud that Schwartz and Esformez and Melgen committed have been purged and replaced with loyalists. It sends a really bad message and really hurts DOJ efforts at creating deterrence. In order to reduce healthcare fraud, you need people both to be afraid of getting in trouble, but also for people to believe in the legitimacy of the system, and that's the entire point, right? The point is to destroy the legitimacy of the system. The point is to ensure that the wealthy and connected don't fear consequences. The point is to create a legal environment where if you're rich enough, if you're connected enough, if you can afford the $1 million lobbying fee, then you are above the law. Everyone else is subject to its full punitive weight. Let's talk about the scale of Trump's pardon corruption, because the numbers are genuinely shocking and revelatory of the authoritarian project underway. Trump has pardoned or commuted the sentences of nearly 1,600 people this year, including hundreds who stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, as well as a range of disgraced politicians, white-collar fraudsters, and other well-connected figures. And of the 89 other pardons or commutations that Trump has signed, more than two-thirds covered people sentenced during former President Joe Biden's term, which means Trump is systematically undoing prosecutions of criminals convicted under the previous administration, creating a clear message that if you commit crimes during a Democratic presidency, just wait for Trump to return and he'll erase your conviction. The pace of those clemency grants has far exceeded any prior administration, and Trump and his top aides have established a far more ad hoc pipeline that frequently privileges those who share the president's political beliefs or social circle. Trump's second-term pardons and commutations are notable for their political and personal connections to the president, and there's more of a sense of the insider pardon than we've seen previously. And the stepped-up cadence has driven a boomlet of lobbying for pardons, whereby wealthy people hire Trump world figures in hopes of getting their case to the front of the line, and the White House tried to discourage the practice, including by pausing its pardons earlier this spring. Amid reports some representatives were charging clients millions of dollars, but of course the pause was temporary, and the practice continues, and if you're a donor or political supporter you move to the front of the line, and this is no longer even hidden. This is how the system openly functions now. Trump's corrupt pardon spree will deprive victims and survivors of crime of $1.3 billion in restitution and fines owed to them and American taxpayers, and when Trump issued a mass blanket pardon to 1,500 January 6 felons and dozens of white-collar criminals, he wiped out $1.3 billion in restitution payments and fines they owed directly to their victims and to American taxpayers, and let that sink in, $1.3 billion, that crime victims will never receive money that was supposed to compensate people who were defrauded, robbed, assaulted by Trump's pardoned criminals, and Trump just erased it with the stroke of a pen. Trump's use of his clemency power to erase restitution owed to victims is a sharp break with established practice, and the traditional standards require that the individual seeking a pardon has accepted responsibility for criminal conduct and made restitution to its victims. But Trump doesn't care about victims. Trump cares about wealthy criminals who can pay for access. Trump cares about rewarding loyalty and punishing opposition. And in Schwartz's specific case, the details are even more damning than the Democratic congresswoman outlined, because Skyline faced investigations and lawsuits across several states, including Medicaid fraud allegations in Arkansas and Nebraska, civil suits from former employees alleging stolen health insurance funds, and state actions to remove Skyline from troubled facility, which means this wasn't just tax fraud, this was a pattern of systematic theft and neglect across multiple states, and Schwartz was required to pay a $100,000 fine and $5 million in restitution, but the president's full and unconditional pardon means he will get any money he paid toward fines and restitution returned to him, which is utterly obscene. The man stole from workers, stole from taxpayers, ran nursing homes so badly that states had to seize them to protect residents, and now he gets his restitution money back and walks free to his $1 million home. Now let's connect this to the broader political economy of cruelty that defines this moment, because the Medicaid cuts aren't just about money, they're about reimposing class discipline, about reminding poor and working people of their precarity and vulnerability. Republicans are pushing proposals that could sharply cut funding to the government health insurance program for poor and disabled Americans as a way to finance President Trump's agenda for tax cuts and border security. Republicans in Congress want to pass deep and damaging cuts to Medicaid to pay for tax cuts for wealthy people as part of their budget legislation. And this is the fundamental class war of our time, dressed up in the language of fiscal responsibility and government efficiency, when it's actually just theft, sanctioned theft, organized theft as policy. Adding work requirements could put as many as 36 million people at risk of losing their benefits, and these work requirements are specifically designed to kick people off coverage, not to help them find employment, because we already know from every state that's tried this, that work requirements just create bureaucratic barriers that prevent eligible people from maintaining coverage. Reducing the 90% Medicaid expansion match could prompt many states to drop out of the expansion program, and could reduce Medicaid spending by $1.9 trillion over a decade. And if all states ended their expansion coverage, up to 20 million people could lose their benefits, and 20 million people losing healthcare isn't an unfortunate side effect. It's the intended outcome, because the cruelty is the point. The suffering is the goal, because a population that's sick and desperate and terrified is a population that's easier to control, easier to exploit, easier to extract value from. And let's talk about who gets hurt by these cuts, because Medicaid has helped to narrow health inequities for people with low incomes across the country, including rural residents of all races, and especially Black, Latino, and Indigenous people, who experience unique barriers to healthcare, and cutting Medicaid funding would particularly harm these people. And of course it would, because that's how structural racism operates in America. It operates through policies that appear race-neutral on their surface, but have devastating racially disparate impacts, and when you cut Medicaid, you're cutting access to prenatal care for Black mothers who already face maternal mortality rates comparable to developing nations. You're cutting diabetes management for Latino communities with higher rates of the disease. You're cutting addiction treatment for Indigenous communities, ravaged by the opioid epidemic. You're cutting mental health services for poor white communities in Appalachia, who've been told their problems are their own fault, even as the economic system has abandoned them completely. Republicans have forced nearly $500 billion in cuts to Medicare, and because of statutory requirements to automatically impose budget cuts when legislation increases the deficit, the big beautiful bill would require automatic sequestration cuts, and Medicare is one of the programs that will face the axe, and the damage sums to $490 billion over the next 10 years, and they're cutting Medicare too, the program that Trump repeatedly promised he would never touch. The bill changes the enrollment process for the Medicare Savings Program, which helps poor seniors afford their prescriptions, and this could lead to more than 1.3 million poor seniors losing access to this program, incurring thousands of dollars in new costs that they will not be able to afford. And we're talking about seniors on fixed incomes, who already choose between food and medication, who already ration their prescriptions, who already delay necessary care because they can't afford it. And Trump is making it worse deliberatively, intentionally, cruelly. The congresswoman said Trump is laughing at his voters, and she's right. But it's worse than that, because Trump isn't just laughing at his voters, he's stealing from them. He's literally taking money from their Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and handing it to billionaires and fraudsters. They don't see it, or won't see it, because the right-wing media apparatus has convinced them that their enemies are immigrants and trans kids and critical race theory, and not the people actually robbing them blind. And this is the genius of reactionary politics, right? You convince people to focus their rage downward, at those with even less power, even less money, even less security, rather than upward at the people who are actually exploiting them, and you wrap it all in nationalism and traditionalism, and you tell them they're defending Western civilization, when really they're just defending the right of billionaires to pay lower taxes than school teachers. And we need to understand the philosophical framework that justifies this in conservative thought, because it's not accidental, it's not random, it emerges from a coherent if morally repugnant worldview that sees hierarchy as natural and necessary, that sees inequality as the rightful order of things, that sees poverty as evidence of moral failure rather than structural violence. And this goes back to the earliest days of conservative political philosophy, Edmund Burke defending the Ancien regime against the French Revolution, arguing that hereditary aristocracy and social hierarchy were ordained by tradition and prescription, and that's what we're watching now, the restoration of essentially feudal relationships dressed up in the language of free markets and individual responsibility, when there's nothing free about a market rigged by the powerful, and nothing individual about responsibility, when your life chances are determined by your zip code and your parents' wealth, and your access to health care. Corrupt public officials are rarely considered for presidential pardons because of the betrayal of public trust, and Trump is really sort of normalizing public corruption by liberally pardoning corrupt public officials who are charged with offenses that involve abusing their political offices to enrich themselves. The pardons that Trump is granting are not principled, and they're out of sync with other parts of his stated political agenda, and it is very hard to reconcile the idea of pardoning a large-scale international drug trafficker with the administration's stated commitment to ending illegal drug trafficking, because Trump pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of running one of the largest drug trafficking operations in the world, while his administration claims to be fighting narco-terrorism. And you can't make this up. The contradictions are so blatant, so shameless, that they function as a kind of epistemic violence against anyone trying to understand policy through the lens of coherent principles rather than naked power and corruption. Trump is normalizing public corruption by liberally pardoning corrupt public officials, and Trump seems to pardon people in whom he sees something of himself, and the pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez is an example of another world leader who was prosecuted for crimes involving the abuse of his office, and Trump can relate to and empathize with that person. And there it is, the psychology of autocracy. Trump identifies with corrupt leaders because he is a corrupt leader. Trump pardons people who abuse power because he abuses power. Trump protects fraudsters because he is a fraudster. George Mason warned that an overly broad pardon power may sometimes be exercised to screen from punishment those whom the president had secretly instigated to commit the crime, and thereby prevent the discovery of his own guilt. And we're watching that play out in real time. This brings us to the larger crisis of legitimacy facing American institutions, because when the law protects but does not bind the wealthy and powerful, while it binds but does not protect everyone else, then we no longer have a legal system, we have a class enforcement mechanism. This decays the integrity of our democracy, like acid, and Trump is abusing the power to reward partisan political allies, enabling pay-for-pardon schemes, and attempting to decriminalize corruption. And the question becomes, what do you do when the institutions designed to check corruption have been captured by the corrupt, when the people tasked with enforcing the law decide the law doesn't apply to them and their friends, when the constitutional mechanisms of accountability have been systematically dismantled? The president's ability to pardon is an awesome power, and when used as intended, it is a powerful tool for justice. However, it can also be a tool of greed and perversion if used inappropriately and contrary to its purpose. And we are deep in the greed and perversion phase now, and Congress could limit the pardon power legislatively, and one bill would require the Justice Department and President to provide Congress materials pertaining to a pardoned individual's prosecution and pardon, and would make it clear that pardons could not be doled out in exchange for bribes. But of course that bill will never pass, because Republicans control Congress, and they benefit from this system. They are enriched by this system. Their donors demand this system. We're living through the construction of oligarchy in real time, the formalization of plutocratic rule, where money doesn't just influence policy, it determines legal outcomes, where wealth doesn't just buy comfort and security, it buys immunity from justice. Trump's blanket immunity effectively creates a special class of people, the pardoned class, and as the president's staunchest and most fanatical supporters, they are essentially above the law, and this is how authoritarianism consolidates. You create a privileged in-group bound by loyalty to the leader, and you grant them legal immunity while you criminalize dissent and opposition, and you ensure that the law becomes a weapon to be wielded against enemies, rather than a neutral arbiter of justice. And what makes this moment so dangerous, so genuinely terrifying if we're honest, is that we've crossed thresholds that will be very difficult to uncross, because once you've established that presidential pardons can be purchased, once you've demonstrated that healthcare fraud on a massive scale will be forgiven, if you're connected, once you've shown that cutting healthcare for the poor to finance tax cuts for the rich is politically viable, then you've fundamentally altered the terrain of what's possible, what's acceptable, what's normal, and Trump has systematically deployed pardons to reward loyalists and reassure associates that they can violate the law with impunity. And that last part is crucial, because it's not just about past crimes, it's about future ones. It's about creating an environment where Trump's associates know they can break the law in service of his agenda, and he will protect them. The congresswoman in that clip is doing important work, bearing witness, speaking truth, documenting the crimes, but we need to ask ourselves what comes after documentation, because we've documented everything we've exposed, everything we've proven, everything with receipts and evidence and testimony. It doesn't matter to his supporters, and it doesn't prevent Republicans from doing it again. And this is the crisis of democratic accountability in an age of partisan polarization and asymmetric polarization, where one party has abandoned any pretense of governing according to norms or rules or even basic decency, and the other party keeps thinking, if they just explain the facts clearly enough, if they just make the case forcefully enough, then surely people will see, surely people will care, and they don't, or they can't, or the information never reaches them, because they live in hermetically sealed media ecosystems designed to insulate them from uncomfortable truths. So what do? Populist anger over corruption is historically one of the forces that takes down would-be autocrats, and people understand that corruption is fundamentally unfair, as long as they understand how it affects their lives. And that's the work, the political work, the moral work, the organizing work. We have to connect the corruption to people's lived material reality. We have to make visible the direct line between Trump's pardon of a nursing home fraudster and Grandma's substandard care, between Medicaid cuts and the cancer treatment you can't afford, between tax cuts for billionaires and the school that's falling apart, and the bridge that's crumbling, and the water that's poisoned. And we have to build power, real material organized power, that can challenge the oligarchs, because they will not relinquish control voluntarily, they will not be shamed into decency, they will not be fact-checked into submission. This is about building mass movements, this is about strikes and boycotts and direct action, this is about mutual aid networks that demonstrate solidarity, works better than charity, this is about making it politically impossible, economically unsustainable for them to continue extractive and exploiting, because right now the costs of their corruption are borne by everyone else, and the benefits accrue to them, and we have to reverse that equation, we have to make them pay the costs. When this insane era is over, we will need reforms that rein in the power of the executive, because many of the unwritten guardrails were rooted in a belief that virtue and character would be a self-corrective, and the founders apparently did not anticipate an era in which shamelessness was considered a political superpower. The congresswoman ends by saying Trump is laughing at his voters, and she's right, but here's what Trump doesn't understand, what the oligarchs never understand, which is that there's a limit to how much you can steal from people before they realize what's happening, before the cognitive dissonance becomes unsustainable, before the material conditions become so dire that the propaganda stops working, and we're not there yet, but we're heading there fast, because you can only cut people's health care and pardon the people who robbed their health care so many times before even the most loyal supporters start to wonder if maybe they're the marks, maybe they're the suckers, maybe the greatest con of all was convincing them that a billionaire from Manhattan who lives in a golden tower and pardons healthcare fraudsters is somehow on their side, somehow fighting for them. And to everyone watching this who feels that rising sense of rage and betrayal and moral clarity, good, that's appropriate, that's the correct emotional response to witnessing systemic injustice and corruption. But rage alone isn't enough. We need to channel it. We need to organize it. We need to transform it into sustained collective action, because they're counting on us to be outraged for a news cycle and then move on. They're counting on our exhaustion, on our cynicism, on our despair, and we have to deny them that. We have to remain angry and focused and organized, and we have to build the kind of movement that can actually challenge power, that can actually redistribute wealth, that can actually create a society where healthcare is a right, where elderly people are cared for with dignity, where workers aren't robbed by their bosses, where justice is blind to wealth and power. This is the fight, this is the moment, and when future historians look back at this era, they will judge us not by whether we were outraged. The outrage is easy, it's justified, it costs nothing. They will judge us by whether we built something, whether we organized, whether we fought, whether we created the kind of solidarity and collective power that could actually challenge the oligarchs and win, and the time for that work is now, because every day we wait another nursing home fraudster gets pardoned, another $1 billion gets cut from Medicaid, another million people lose health care, another piece of the social fabric gets shredded by people who view human suffering as an acceptable cost of their enrichment, and we have to say no, we have to say enough, we have to build the power to make it stop, because no one is coming to save us. We have to save each other, and that starts with understanding exactly what they're doing to us, and refusing to accept it as normal, or inevitable, or just how things are, because it's not how things have to be, it's how things are, when we let oligarchs rule unopposed, and that ends when we decide it ends.